Welcome to the interview series. The interview series is a production of One Week Critique, an Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our website, oneweekcritique.com. That's the number one, weekcritique.com. And please like and subscribe to help us continue producing valuable content. I'm Matthew Schmidt, joined today by Joe Meno. Joe Meno is a writer and cultural journalist who lives in Chicago. A winner of the Nelson Algren Literary Award, a Pushcart Prize, a Great Lakes Book Award, and a finalist for the Story Prize, he is the author of 7 novels: Marvel and a Wonder, Office Girl, The Great Perhaps, The Boy Detective Fails, Hairstyles of the Damned, How the Hula Girl Sings, and Tender as Hellfire. The short story collections are Bluebirds Used to Croon in the Choir and Demons in the Spring. The short fiction has been published in the likes of McSweeney's, One Story, Swink, Lit, Tri-Quarterly, Other Voices, Gulf Coast, and broadcast on NPR. He is also the creator of Star Witness, a 7-part serial on electric literature. He was a contributing editor to Punk Planet, the seminal underground arts and politics magazine. His nonfiction has appeared in the New York Times and Chicago Magazine. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks so much, Matthew. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, so today we're in Iowa City. You're reading at Prairie Lights tonight.
It's such an honor. It's one of my favorite bookstores in the country. Really, it is an incredible kind of cultural institution that draws all, writers, artists, different people together. And so important, especially over the last 2 years, see how independent bookstores have served as these kind of community touchstones, opportunities for people to gather. And over the last 2 years, many of us were kind of stuck indoors and cut off for that. I really felt that absence. So I'm so happy to be back in Iowa City and visiting Prairie Lights.
No, it's great. And yeah, they were closed for a while, or you could only go in there with a mask. And
right.
So all that was lost.
Yeah, and in Chicago, some of our favorite bookstores, there you could order books online and go and kind of pick them up. And as wonderful as that is, there's something about browsing and getting lost or getting a recommendation and just having that opportunity to explore that I feel like I just took for granted for every kind of up until this particular point in my life. And so it's so wonderful we have this chance to get back. Been trying to head out to see as many authors coming through Chicago. And it's one of those things that I think I just took for granted for so long. And I'm excited we have the opportunity to start doing these events again.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite things is stumbling onto a book you would never find otherwise. Yeah. Just in the stacks and, checking it out. And
exactly.
It's great. Exactly. Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about your new book, which is Book of Extraordinary Tragedies. Here's a copy here, and that's on Akashic Books. So I thought we would just start by talking a little bit about how you approach writing the novel.
So everything that I've ever written, whether it's a short story or a novel or some plays, some screenplays, it always starts as something small. In this case, a short story, and actually a couple different short stories. So nearly 20 years ago, 18 years ago, I wrote this short story called Midway about these 2 brothers. I was fortunate enough to win the Nelson Algren Award for it. And it was about these 2 brothers on the south side of Chicago. They get thrown out of their house and have to live by Midway Airport. And I had all these other literary projects, but I kept coming back to those 2 brothers. But I could never find the shape of this story. And so I would write a couple more scenes and then put it away, another couple, and then this older sister popped up. And I put it away for another couple months or even years, and then my cousin popped up, and slowly over the course of 10, 15 years, I started developing this family, really with no intention other than here are these interesting characters. I haven't seen these kind of characters in short fiction or in a novel or in a TV show or in a movie, and I kept coming back to them. And I was at the same time writing these other stories about like a young man in the neighborhood I grew up in on the south side of Chicago, kind of coming of age. And, I'm Polish and Croatian on one side of my family. And that culture is really powerful in the city of Chicago, right? Like it's the second largest population of Polish people outside of Warsaw, Poland, right?
Is it really?
It's enormous, but it's also silent and it kind of anonymous and invisible, purposely so, And so I found myself writing about that. And the last part was over the last maybe 15, 16 years, I have been slowly losing my hearing. And I was writing some nonfiction about that. And then finally found a way to start writing about it in fiction through this character. And it was those kind of three different threads of like, here's this material about these two brothers and this family. Here's this story about this kid who's like part of this Eastern European community. And then here's like some, material based on my own experience of losing my hearing. And I started seeing how they were all kind of echoing or complementing each other. But it's always in pieces. It's always like, here's this section that's a short story. Here's this scene that's just like literally floating where he meets a girl who goes to college and he's kind of amazed just hanging out in her dorm room. And here's another thing about this kid and his grandfather. And it was really a lot of trial and error, stumbling around where you're just taking these different pieces. I think of it almost like geometrically, or like trying to build a structure or a building in terms of like architecture. You're like, here's this thing, this is a door, these are windows, and you're moving these things around to find out like what's the most interesting way, and you just don't know. Like I do not know, like, does this scene where he takes his niece to daycare and gets yelled at, like, is that something that makes more sense at the beginning? Does that make more sense here? And the only way I can really figure it out is by literally like shuffling them around once I've written a bunch of scenes. So it's completely unreasonable. It's totally illogical. But for me, this is like my eighth novel. There's like this joy. It's gotten to the point where there's like a joy in not knowing, where you trust, where you hope that eventually it'll resolve itself. And there's a pleasure in experimenting and moving these different pieces around to find the most interesting shape. It's just taken a long time to get to that point where you find it pleasurable and not like, bang your head against the wall. I feel like I should give up. And then at some late stage, once I was like, okay, here's some scenes that I feel like come towards the beginning where you meet these characters and there's this hint that Alex's older sister Isabel has this illness and she's gonna move back home. And then here's some scenes from the middle where he gets thrown out of the house for stealing a computer. Here's some scenes toward the end where he starts to branch out in his neighborhood and meet these other characters. I started to recognize the shape of the book, progression of the book, was closer to like a piece of music. And I wanted to have these like dynamics and highs and lows. So because music is such a huge part of the story, Alex and his older sister used to play classical music when they were kids. And I started thinking, well, why not try and do this as just a piece of music? Like, what if this was just shaped the way a symphony is shaped in four kind of distinct parts? And once I kind of found that container, then I could start making choices, getting rid of things, expanding things kind of based on that shape. But that basic process is the same thing I do for every piece of writing, whether it's a piece of short fiction or essay or nonfiction, play, screenplay. It's like 95% of what I do is just writing a bunch of stuff. And then once I have some stuff, I'm moving it around. And then I'm like, okay, what's the shape? And then I try to think, is there a connection between the shape, the overall structure, like what this story is about? if I can find that, then it allows me to make some really clear decisions about this should stay or we can get rid of this. But it is, like I said, it is not a straight line.
Yeah.
And this takes years, so this was really a book. The earliest iteration of it was from 2003, that one short story, some other short stories over, that time. And then a lot in the last couple of years of like, okay, here's the book, I'm gonna figure out the structure.
Yeah. So a couple of questions then about that. Did you play classical music? And of course, I have to ask that. And I was thinking about mathematics.
Yes.
Because you mentioned geometric shape. Uh, you know, when you're moving through the book, are you thinking about time, not necessarily in the form of the story, but in like how long things are taking? And when you move the shapes to have like particular shapes happen at particular times.
That's all right. So let me answer the first question. That's a great question. This is Matthew where I get really excited. I get really excited not just as a writer, but I work with undergraduate students and grad students at Columbia. And there's this debate that's been going on really since the beginning of creative writing programs, like can you teach writing? And what I always say is, well, I can't teach content. It's really not my job to say like you should be writing this, or you shouldn't be. But what I think I have some understanding of is shape and structure, and you can teach that. You can definitely look at the shape of a story and say, well, this is this, this is this, this is this, and what if you tried this? Or this thing has the shape of a journey story, or this has this A, B, A, B, A, B repeated shape, and you can apply that to your story. Or, you know what I mean? There's a lot of different ways. So that's where I get really excited. It's this weird thing, though, but for me to get to the structure, I have to have some raw material. And they kind of ultimately like inspire and reinforce each other in an interesting way. All this goes back to music because music has a shape, and I don't want to like hurt anyone's feelings or offend anybody, but I will probably always maintain that music, because it engages us in such a different way than a book, it allows us to access memory in a much more subversive way. And it kind of bypasses that frontal cortex and it like skirts around it to get to like your body. Like I don't know if you've ever heard a piece of music and you're like, oh my gosh, I heard that when I was 15. And you're 15 for like 10 seconds again. And you almost have this like physical reaction to that. That just rarely occurs with a book in that same way. The most powerful, the most beautiful, richest, the book with the most complex stuff just works in a very different way. I think it's like the reptile part of your brain gets engaged with music, and so you feel it deeper. But all music has a shape. Pop song is like verse, chorus, maybe a break, that verse, chorus, and you know it. And that's what feels really familiar and engaging. You trust it. You don't even have to think about it. A symphony has these 4 unique movements, and this is what happens in the first movement, and so on and so forth. And a piece of jazz music, right, has the head, and the head gets repeated, and then you go into the individual solo. And so, as a former like musician and music journalist, like I'm just infatuated, like so interested in the shape of music, which seems sometimes like when you're listening to a formless, but if you listen on multiple repeats, you start to hear the shape. So a lot of my books have borrowed, either consciously or later, I recognize like, oh, you just stole that from, punk music. You stole that from this thing. You stole that. And so I've used musical structures before because, like I mentioned, like I have this content. I have to like, struggle to find a shape for it, to make it interesting for somebody other than just me, you know? And so I'm like, oh, well, I could use this pop song structure. I could use the blues. I could use all this. I feel like, what if I made a book that felt like the White Album by the Beatles, or you know what I mean? Um, so I grew up playing music. I played guitar. My older sister played piano, but I did not play classical. My grandfather, who was this fascinating Yugoslavian uh, steel worker, and he was also a carpenter. He never went to college, barely finished high school. Every time I went over, he would always be in the back of the house listening to these classical records. And he passed away when I was about 3 or 4 years old. And he was very quiet, kind of taciturn man. He'd always be kind of installed in the back of his house listening to these records. And I remember like going over there and my mom, whoever was saying, like, oh, make sure you go say hi to my grandfather. And like stepping into that like back room, it was like stepping into this other land, this other country, this totally different era, you know, and he'd be back there like smoking. And there were these like sounds that to like a 3, 4 year old, they were like so unconventional, frightening. Like, you know, if you listen to like some of those Russians from the 1930s, 40s, you know, it's like grating, crazy violins and rites of spring, like Stravinsky, right? Like, and there was nothing more frightening to a kid than like go and say your hi to your grandfather, and they're like smoking, listening to this music that felt so like terrifying and unfamiliar. So he passed away when I was younger, and as I was like starting to pull this book together, I was probably about halfway. I was like, okay, it's brother and sister and little brother. I went to visit my mom, and we were like cleaning out her garage, and she had this cardboard box full of classical records. I, up until that point, completely forgot. Like I just forgot that that was a component of his life. And then I started really like digging into him and listening because I had this sense like here was this guy who was a laborer, he like worked with his hands. Like what did he find? Like what did he hear in these songs? You know that like are so complicated and strange and like what was he listening to? So I like started listening to these records, trying to like understand him, or trying to just understand like what was intriguing. So really, up until you know maybe 5 or 6 years ago, when I found these records, I just had always heard classical music as something for someone else or something for my grandfather, but certainly not part of you know the music I listen to. And I feel like I'm really interested in a lot of different kinds of music, you know, pop, rock, hip hop, jazz. But there's something so strange and off-putting, and there's like you know questions of classism, colonization, and you know like music. You know, if you're talking about the Austrians and Germans and the Russians, right, and how they kind of use music as a way to control the culture of places like Poland or Yugoslavia, right? So like, so all these interesting questions that come up, and I thought like, well, what would be like the hardest thing for this kid Alex to be excited about? You know, like what would be the thing that would cause the most conflict in his world on the south side of Chicago? Like if you were in love with something that no one else liked, that's one thing. But if you're like in love with something that people like really hate, like with effort, you know what I mean? Where you like walk out of a room if classical music is playing, you know what I mean? It's like, and so I decided like, oh, that's the thing. And it's this language that Alex and his older sister have together because they grew up playing it and they kind of left it at different points. And it's still meaningful. He still finds joy in it, but he really can't share it with anyone he knows or loves, his friends, the people he's dating. It's like the secret thing that he loves because he recognizes that it's not for most people. But since then, like getting deeper into that music, I recognize like if I approach it the way I would approach like experimental jazz from the 1960s, or like throbbing gristle, or like some strange noisecore band from the 90s. It is as like meaningful and powerful. If I'm only approaching it as a piece of music and not trying to think like, well, about my grandfather or about Eastern European history, and there are some classical pieces of music that I've like just come to love so deeply through this kind of inquiry. So I never played classical music, but it is part of my family. And as I like reflected more and more about it, I definitely recall like, on the Eastern European side of my family, like going over to like a grandmother or aunt or uncle's house. And it's always like playing in the background while like these aunts or uncles would be like smoking. And there would be this game that they played, Matthew, where it was like, who could tell the saddest story? It was like who could like outmatch the other person through this like tale. And it wasn't even conscious. It would be like, well, here's this story about my grandfather and the time the Russians dragged all the horses out and shot them. And here's this other, and it'd be like one after the other. And in its own ways, that kind of had this own musical, like a fugue repeating, like its own musical quality to it. So that became another part of the book as well. Alex and Isabel have this like strange game that they started as kids called Who Suffers More? And it's like hypothetically, like what's the worst thing? And they try to like one up each other.
Yeah. Well, since we started talking a little bit about Alex and Isabel, maybe you could just give a brief summary of the book. And then I'll ask you to read a little bit of the first chapter.
Of course, yeah. So the book, Book of Extraordinary Tragedies, is about Alex. He's a 20-year-old. He's our narrator. He lives on the south side of Chicago. Alex and his older sister Isabel, they grew up in this kind of Eastern European family where classical music was seen as very important. At the age of 10, he started losing his hearing, and really by 12, could no longer kind of play or compete with these different auditions. His older sister leaves classical music to go study mathematics at MIT, and after a year, she kind of just bombs out and has to come back home. Turns out she's pregnant. So by the time the book starts, like Alex is 20, his older sister's 22, things, have not gone the way they thought they would, and the family's really struggling. And the book is about their relationship, really, is at the center of the shape of the book. There's their mother, who deals with depression, and the way she handles it is by like, she's writing a play about Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, and like his little brother is like 13 and really into comic books, but he makes his own version where really sad things happen to like Spider-Man and Invisible Woman and like realistic things,
right.
And it's really about them encountering the endless tragedy that any family or many families are asked to confront over the course of it looks about a year. And it's a book, like I said, that I wanted to have a feeling of it being like a symphony of like there's these highs and lows, but there's ultimately like this this real sense of like joy that Alex finds, particularly in his relationship with his niece, Jazzy. It's his sister's daughter, and he ends up spending a lot of time with her. She's diagnosed with having hearing loss as well. And so they start really developing this close relationship, and she's one of the things he kind of feels most hopeful about. And so it's a coming of age story, and also a story about confronting family and history, and also a story about all the way family kind of inspires us, holds us back, and how there's this, decision oftentimes we have to make between our own lives and the lives of the people we love.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent summary of the story.
Thanks.
Yeah, so let's hear a little bit of the early draft.
So this is from an early chapter. So after I decided this was a book, so I had these different short stories, different scenes, and then I kind of started pulling them together. And I was like, okay, this is going to be this book. And what oftentimes happens, this is the first chapter. It's like I have to write a first chapter just to like get the thing going. But I just know this is not the first chapter. Like this is, I know going into like this is just going to be a placeholder. This some of the stuff might stay, but the first chapter doesn't really get written until everything else gets written. So this is like a nominal, I would say, nominal first chapter. One morning, I dropped my niece off at daycare, riding her on the front of my butt. Jazz is 2.5 and holds on for dear life. Her mother, on drugs, hasn't been feeling well lately from drugs. So I go by and make sure she has her backpack for lunch, her gold gym shoes. The sound of her screaming and giggling atop the handlebars is a profound musical experience, one of my favorite sounds in the world. Her peals of laughter vibrate C-sharp. When I pull up in front of the daycare, she asks when her mother will be feeling better, and I look at her and say, I don't know. I help her fix her backpack, and then I ask, what are you going to do today? And she looks at me and says, run it, and forcefully walks inside. For as long as I can remember, my sister Izzy was disappearing. The sound of her absence, of her footsteps quietly walking away, was in B-flat. When we were young, my mother would tie a piece of string from my wrist to Isabel's whenever we went outside. Somehow I can still feel the tug, the tension at the base of my hand. Imagine the sound of some other person's pulse beating alongside my own. I feel it most when she's upset, when she thinks the world's against her, when she's looking for a way to vanish. Before I even pull up to Izzy's apartment, I can already hear her arguing. 20 years old, in a white t-shirt, even with her hair cut short and dyed blonde, she's impossible to ignore. She has one of her kids in her arms and the other in the backseat of her car. The baby smells of hot vomit. I hop off my 10-speed and hear her ex shouting something from down the block. He has what looks like a recent black eye. I walk over and he hands me one of their boxes. I put it in the back of my sister's Corolla. This is the third or fourth time this has happened, moving out of this particular ex-boyfriend. When we are finished loading the boxes, she picks up a small statue of St. Teresa and throws it at the back of her ex-boyfriend's head. How do you save someone completely intent on destroying themselves? Even Orfeo has no suggestion. So that's from that opening kind of first draft of the chapter of the book.
Excellent. Well, thank you for
reading thanks that. So much.
Yeah, does it feel strange to read that version of it?
So I've never read that out loud. Yeah. It's funny because it's actually like in terms of the basic like questions of the main characters, and even some of those scenes end up in kind of different kind of versions ultimately. It's pretty close. This feels much more like the beginning of a short story, which is again like it's easier to kind of, in a short story you have to get things up and running right away. You got to meet the characters. There's got to be conflict right from the beginning. So you immediately get Alex, you get Jazzy, which to me, like their relationship is really the counterpoint to him and his older sister. And it's a really important part of the book. So that's there, and the language is pretty similar to the overall kind of tone and language in the book. It's a lot more fragmented than the actual first chapter, where it's like, here's this thing, here's this thing, here's this thing. And I think that becomes really useful. Like one of the things that I'm working with a writer, one of my students, and they're trying to like flush out the story, is like giving them permission to take a lot of jumps in time, to be like, okay, well, what happens a week later or a month later, to start kind of tracing out the shape of the events that occur in the story. So I think that's what was probably going on.
Definitely. I think, when I was thinking about this book, that I thought maybe the tragedy that's most forefront is that Alex loves music so much and is, suffering hearing loss. Yeah. And then the family is Fa, F-A.
That's right.
And the children receive what is described as a pseudo-intellectual upbringing. Right. Would you discuss irony in conjunction with the novel? Sure. Because Fa, right? Do, re, mi, fa.
That's right. And also in Italian, it means like past or ago.
Okay.
So yeah, so that wasn't like meant to be like outlandishly ironic. And Matthew, I'll be totally honest, like there is no irony. Like there is no irony genuinely in the being someone who just I just love music. I really fell in love with it when I was like 14. My parents were getting divorced and like that music of all kinds really. That I grew up in the 70s and 80s and I would just record, have a cassette player and a radio, like two separate objects. And I would use the cassette player to record the songs off the radio and listen to those songs. Every night at 9 o'clock, there'd be like the top 10 countdown. And just help give me a sense of meaning, it helped give a shape to some of the things that were happening in my life. And I recognize I've lost, the ability to hear a lot of the music that I love. Like when I first found out I was losing my hearing, then I went and got the test, and I had known I had lost hearing, but I didn't know how bad it was, and I think I just tried to deny it and fool myself. They like show you this graph on an iPad. It was so profound, and I was in denial with it for a long time. And the thing that forced me to confront it and kind of acknowledge it was like I had this idea. It's like, oh my gosh, like I'm losing my hearing. I'm gonna go through and listen to all my favorite records, like almost like as a one last, because I don't know in 5 years or 10 years. And so I try to do this thing where I was like, I'm gonna listen to my 100 favorite records or whatever, 10 favorite, I don't know. And after like the third record, I was like, I know I'm missing stuff. Like, there's things I'm not hearing. The tone sounds different. Or even there'd be certain songs where I would lose like the melody would sound, if it was like in a major or something, it would sound like in a minor, and it just threw me off. And I was like, I just have to recognize like this is what it is. So that thing of this kid who's in love with music and uses it to really make sense of all these things that are happening in his life, and he can't hear it all. Like that's not that's there's a lot of irony in the book. There's a lot of humor. Like that's something that's probably the most personal or like serious. Where it's like that's just me using this book as a way to try to make sense of some of the things that I'm confronting in my own personal life, right? But there are many, like many other instances where the family, and it's almost always a case where like the character purposely chooses the wrong thing that causes, like a humorous moment. So like Jazzy, the niece, gets picked to do this play, but she like won't really kind of, perform, or she like keeps laying down in class and just pretending to be dead. And because she's struggling with being disconnected in class because of her hearing loss, the teacher like has this ingenious idea to like cast her as like a dead person in the play. And so like, and then she takes it like really seriously, And so like it's meant to be funny, but also comes out of like this sadness, like she's dealing with this thing, and then little brother Daniel, he has this like really complicated revenge scheme where like he gets into trouble at school, and then in order to exact his revenge, he's gonna like joins the like academic bowl team in order to like he's gonna like purposely answer, give the wrong answer at this academic bowl to like shame this teacher that's done it wrong. So like there are these moments of humor that almost always come out of like a character who's struggling. Like they're trying to like make sense of these things that are happening to them. And their like first reaction is like definitely the wrong. But those reactions and those like kind of things are like the things I think I most deeply identify with. Where like that's how I think. I'm like, oh, this is really hard. Like I would just like to lay down and not have to deal with this thing. Or like I wish I could get back at that teacher who made me mad. And how great would it be to like purposely say their own thing, And so it's hopefully an occasion where the characters feel complex and you're never laughing at them. You're not feel like, oh, these are characters and the narrator, Alex, is making fun of them, or that as the writer, like we're laughing at these people. You're laughing because they're human and they're flawed. Um, in my life, the life of my family, the people I know, like oftentimes when something hard comes down, make the wrong decision first, maybe again, it takes a little time, especially if it's something that's challenging and enduring. And so, yeah, I think that humor is a huge part of the book, but hopefully it deepens our understanding of the character. And it's never something like, I think in the 90s, there were some really great books where there was irony used to make fun or disempower something. And that's really not my intention. It's to see like, wow, these people are having a hard time here, and like they're trying their best and not succeeding. And is there something actually kind of beautiful in that? There's something beautiful in the failure. Someone is like trying and they just can't do it. Like it's actually beautiful. And I think of these pieces of classical music from my grandfather that way, as these like strange, complicated like failures. Like you listen to Mozart or you listen to Beethoven, these incredible pieces of music, and they're struggling to like give a shape to what it's like to be alive in the 18th century or to fall in love, to lose your country, whatever it is, and they're like trying to throw all this music at this thing. And it's just like any book or play or movie, you're like, well, did it capture everything? And so it's that thing of like the character who tries and throws everything at it and they try and they probably still fail. That's the thing that feels like most interesting to me about character.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wasn't necessarily suggesting
No,
that the irony was used in a certain way.
Yeah.
It was just something I wondered what you thought about.
Yeah.
But I do agree that I think, as far as the characters go, it does make me think of like my own family, because when someone does something, or like at work, someone's doing something to them or whatever, then it seems like you talk to one family member and they're like, well, here's what they should do.
Right.
And then you talk to someone else and they're like, what are they even doing with this? And it's like so many different angles on what should be done about this situation.
Right.
And you're just sitting there going like, huh, I don't even know the people.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
like that you're talking about in this particular situation. I don't know what to tell you.
Right. Well, and I think that's what's so puzzling and frustrating about these people you like grow up with, love, is that ultimately like they're different than you, they make different decisions. And instead of, I think I finally got to the point, I have an older sister, younger brother, where like I'm just amazed at the things they do.
Yeah.
And even when it's like, oh, I wouldn't have done that. You know what I mean? That's cool. And it's like this form of grace, you're offering to be like, I just don't like, I don't know, I'm not in your situation, I don't have your experience. To be like, well, you're trying, and to be like, well, to see someone trying as an act of kind of beauty, even when it ends badly, that I don't know. I feel like that's how I'm thinking about my family or the people that I love. It's like, did they try? Even if it didn't work out, you know. That seems like such an important component in this book, and it just, I think about the people that I love as well.
Yeah, no, that's it's a thing. Like, I don't think I could do either job either of my siblings has.
Yeah.
Like, I just couldn't do it. Like, I mean, I could go and do it for a little while, but like, I don't have the mind space to do it.
Yeah.
And then I'm always, then you're always thinking like, I wonder what they think of what I'm doing.
Right. Yeah.
I'm like out here doing like whatever.
Yeah. No, but I think that's what's fascinating is like that there's these endless variations, right? Like, well, we have pretty much the same upbringing, we have the same DNA, and to see just how these different people you love move in all these different directions and have such different opinions, and like it does have this like this very musical quality where like there's this repetition, melody, and of we have these similarities, but the way you're approaching this, the way you're handling this is much more, adventure. My little sister works for the Peace Corps. She lived in Panama for life. So I don't know if that's me. Like, I don't know if I could do that, and she does it. And it's incredibly important work. And I'm so proud of her, and so, I think that thing is endlessly fascinating. All the different decisions that your siblings make and how they're still closely connected. So that was definitely something I wanted to bring out in the book as well.
Well, I definitely think you've accomplished that. It did have a lot more characters in this early
draft. Well, first of all, I recognize like Alex I think he's like 18. So, and then his older sister Isabel is 20. So they're a little bit younger. She has 2 kids. And then there's more siblings.
Right.
And I got to this point where I think I had 7 siblings.
I wanted to say it was 7 too.
Maybe it was 7 or 8. And there was just so many. And I liked that idea because, like, when you're doing an early draft, you're like, well, I'll just go over and just talk to these characters now. And it gave me a lot of freedom to, like, build new scenes. And I think as I was approaching, like, a 200-page draft of all these different characters, I was like, just too disparate. And there wasn't enough space, to, like, develop the individual characters that I did have. And so I was like, okay, well, what if it's just Alex and Isabel? And then there's the mom and the cousin and Jazzy. And you're kind of having those characters as the main ones that we follow.
Yeah, no, I think you get really locked in, but you move around, like if the book moves around a lot as well. It doesn't feel static.
Oh, that's great.
You know what I mean? Like there are different situations that happen and you can see characters' minds change and people try different strategies and to varying degrees of success or failure, exactly. Right? And that's how life is.
Yeah.
I was actually talking to a friend earlier and we were talking about revision in general and he goes, well, isn't life just revision?
Yeah,
and I go,
well, here's what's interesting. Yeah, that's exactly right. I feel like these pieces of music, Mozart, Rites of Spring, that melody was pulled from a Russian folk song. Mm-hmm. John Cage, there's this John Cage record, this composition that's mentioned in the book, where he pulled these like 6, 7, 8 different pieces of music from like the 14th century, and he constructed a new piece of music. I mean, everything we know about hip hop from the 80s and 90s, even now, it's here's this thing, I'm gonna reimagine it in a new context. This book is completely that, where it's like, here's this short story, and here's this other thing, and I'm gonna try to imagine a larger, or kind of different version, and that's like all I do all day. Like as a person, you're like, oh, like I'm gonna be totally honest. This is gonna sound off topic, maybe, but I'm like, the idea of like Russia in 2022 being this like force, it's kind of people, the bad guys. It's like so because I grew up with that in the 70s and 80s. It kind of went away for a while, and you're like, oh, like maybe life is just way more circular and orbital or whatever than I previously, like I would never, like I grew up and went to all these punk shows. in the 80s and saw these kids who were like skinheads. And then I didn't see those people for a while. And then in like 2017 in Charlottesville, I was shocked. I was like, what? And it's just this weird circular quality of like, here's this thing, and it comes back again in this different context. So the one thing I feel like I recognize at this point in my life is that I can't stop these things from happening. I can't stop Russia. It's like I can try, I can donate to causes and stuff like that. I can't stop these white supremacists. Like, but I can take these things and try and assemble them in a way that gives me meaning. You know, like I can take these things in the way that musicians, you know, for centuries now, like here's these different pieces, I can try to put them together in a way that feels meaningful.
Well, it's funny that you started talking about circularity because you had mentioned the White Album earlier. And of course, there's the Gray Album.
Yes.
Which uses the White Album along with Jay-Z.
I love it.
Right?
It's
so like
incredible. I remember when that came out, it felt like such a breakthrough and discovery, and it also felt totally inevitable. Mm-hmm. At the same time, like, of course, this makes complete sense, right? And that like it gave both the Jay-Z and the Beatles like this different context. You know what I mean? And I find that in a strange way, like classical music and hip hop are really, really similar. You know, and this idea that like Mozart and how bombastic and like he wrote these songs where he took like his contemporaries' riffs and he would put them in his song and redo them and like make fun of the original context. And like that's just like straight up dissing. Mm-hmm. Like that's all that was. You know what I mean? Like that's like a battle, you know, and so it's like, oh, like in the pomposity of like how pompous these guys were but there's like this bravado that's also like really attractive and compelling and human and interesting. That's part of like the size and scale of these pieces. And you're like, well, that's pretty much Kanye West to me. And like it's pretty much the same. And so like, and that's what's attractive to me about his music. It's like huge and everything's on this epic scale. And so all you're doing, I think, you know, as a reader, as like a person in the world, is like identifying, oh, I've seen this thing before. And here's this new, interesting way to recontextualize, you know, and they're not really that far. You're like, oh, I've seen this question in the book, and it's come up again, and let's see how this writer kind of, you know, addresses it or shapes it.
I might be a little too excited. No. I was thinking about this, and I can't think of a book that does this exactly. But in hip hop, there's often the guest.
Yes, 100%.
Right? And you've got X bars.
Yeah.
Right? You do your thing.
Someone comes in and does it first.
Well, do you know of any books where it's literally like someone writes almost the entire book?
Yes.
But every once in a while, someone has a guest spot.
Let's do it, Matthew. Next book. I think that's a brilliant. I mean, there's like introductions and there's like, you know, notes at the end that might be from like some other text or author. But I can't think of one where it's like 80%. It's like, here's the text, here's the voice of this one particular author, and then inserted like 3/4 of the way in, there's this like, and I think it's a great idea. You know what? I will say that like it's like such a musical tradition, at least in America, for like 2 verses and then a break, you know, and started with like rhythm and blues and then rock and roll. And rock and roll, there's like the guitar solo or whatever, you know. It was, and now in like hip hop, you have the like switch to like the guest verse or whatever. I was like really aware in this book as like the book was coming to like 2/3 of the way through that like there has to be a break. Mm-hmm. You know, like for the book, so much of what you're doing as a storyteller is pattern building.
Right.
You're almost like spending the first 2/3, whether it's a short story or a play or a book, of like building these patterns. And then about 2/3 of the way through, I believe you have to break the pattern. Because what you're trying to do in that last third is demonstrate some significant change. So the pattern might be the language of the character. It might be how they interact with the other characters in dialogue. It might be where the story takes place. It might be the length of the chapters. It might be the kinds of forms that you're using. Like, is it all scenes? Does it use letters? Does it use these other forms? And there's this part where Alex, he goes to Isabel's ex-boyfriend. And he's mistreated Isabel, and he has this kind of like idea that's not really thought out that he's gonna like somehow defend her, even though she would never want that. But he's so upset. He's so angry. He like rides his bike over to this house, and he's like, and he steals something. And he knows even as he's doing it, like this is a horrible idea. Like this is gonna only end one way, and it does.
Right.
And these guys show up and like they really beat him badly. And as he's like sitting on the curb, you know, throughout the whole book, he's imagining not just these like symphonies in his head, these like imaginary symphonies, but he's also like he's recognizing he's losing his hearing. He's trying to like think about silence and trying to like find the beauty in silence. And there's this shift in the book that's kind of based around that, where it forces the reader to like literally just stop and be silent, you know. And I was trying to think like, how do you do that in a text? And so that's kind of what I arrived at, almost with that same intention, this idea that like when you get 2/3 of the way through, the reader has to feel like, oh my gosh, anything could happen. Like the book could break.
Right.
And it has to kind of break, you know, for it to continue to be interesting.
Right. Yeah, you can't just, you don't want to hear the same verse again.
Yeah, or you don't want the same, or you want it to feel.
It has to feel somehow different.
That the song cracks open or the book is broken open in this really interesting way. So that was, yeah, my attempt to try and, again, it was directly taken on the, like, the popular music.
Yeah. So this book's set in Chicago. I'm not certain you've lived in Chicago your whole life, but you were born there.
That's right. Yeah.
So did you need to do any type of research, or is a lot of this based on experience? How did that go?
So the book is set. Most of the book is set in the neighborhood where I grew up on the south side around 99th Street. But parts of the book, as the book goes on, and Alex's kind of world starts to expand from that neighborhood to parts of the city, there was some research about the Eastern European community that I just really wasn't aware of, or was more anecdotal that I had to do research about. And then there was certainly connections between my own family and some historical events in Eastern Europe that I definitely had to research and make sense of. But the geography of Chicago, you know, it's pretty lived in, it's pretty based on places that I know. And it's like there's the Chicago River, which everyone knows is there, and you like drive your car over it and ride your bike past it, but like you see it so often you fail to recognize it's a river. It's like it's really mysterious, strange. Like you'll encounter it away from downtown and you're like, oh my gosh, there's a river here. And it's just like a different context. So there were places like that in the city that as Alex is like kind of growing and moving farther away from his neighborhood, he's starting to find there's this place, Lower Wacker Drive, which is famous in like the Batman movies, where it's like a chase scene or whatever. And it's like dark and mesmerizing and frightening, but also kind of amazing that even exists. And like he accidentally ends up down there on his bike, and so just trying to build some of those places into the book as well. And those were not places that, as a young person growing up in that neighborhood, I just have never encountered. You know, in the neighborhood I grew up in, it was like, there's this feeling now, like going downtown. It's like going to this other city, or that you had to have this knowledge or class or status. Or like, what if they make fun of you? What if someone like asks you a question or like asks direction and you can't, you know what I mean? And it's still to this day, this feeling like almost like imposter syndrome. And so that's kind of built into it. In the first part of the book, he's really kind of cloistered into that neighborhood he's grown up in, and then slowly kind of starts to branch out.
Yeah. So we had briefly mentioned this, but my idea maybe came out of Alex's amazing compositions.
Yes.
And these are compositions where he is thinking up a new way to write, I guess, a classical song mostly.
Right.
And they become like bigger and bigger,
Right.
kind of, where like something, not even an instrument or something from an orchestra
Right.
would be used.
Right.
And so I think that is one of the positive traits of this book, which is like it lets you, as the reader, like go a lot of different places. And wherever I thought it would go, I'm sure another reader is going to go somewhere completely different. So I guess what I'm suggesting is it's interesting that there are so many games within the book that actually are real life situations. And we sit down to play games at a table,
Right.
or we sit down in front of a TV and play games. And yet we're always in some sort of game within society
Right.
that is taking place, and the stakes are different than, say, a board game or something.
Right. Yeah, and I think one of the facets was here's this kid who has this love for music. He can't really access it in the same way, growing up playing classical music. But he's also recognized the limitations. Like he's 20, you realize like most people don't listen to classical music, cousin listens to hip hop. Like he knows like a lot of people don't find meaning in this thing. And so he's kind of like imagining these compositions, and they do get kind of progressively more imaginative, more impossible, like as the book goes on, as a way to entertain this like creative impulse that he has, but also they're like a reaction to things going on in his life. It's very similar to a writer sitting down and like writing fiction, or a musician composing a piece of music, or painter painting something. It's like you encounter different challenges, tragedies, and like how do you respond? And the way that, like in my life, I've been really fortunate is like, well, I can't stop these tragedies from happening. They're just going to keep coming. Like, the one thing I can do is try to build something, try to make something, even if it's pretend. And so like the power, like, and how empowering that feels. Whether you make it for yourself or to share with somebody else, like all you can do is take these things and try and build something. So it's really this survival tool in his own life, and it turns out really in the life of his family, is that like, how do you face these tragedies and continue to survive? Having that mechanism, even if it's in your head, when you make up a song or make up a poem or story, whatever it is. I recognize probably too late how fundamentally important that is. That activity of like creation as a way to kind of keep your head above the water.
Definitely. Well, you have built something. Maybe we could hear just a little bit.
Sure. So I'll read a little from the actual first. So this actually begins with one of the compositions, these kind of imaginary compositions that Alex is creating. The book begins with one of his. Begin in F sharp minor with the Symphony of Ghost Notes. Why not a concerto that details every note in silence, or the most noiseless overture in all of history. Let the trumpets go mute and the cymbals be still. Let the lull from the concert hall destroy every awkward moment, every long-standing argument with cannons raging in unheard fury, and the closing note being fireworks exploding soundlessly in the sky, so that everything finally goes quiet. What would Mozart have to say to that? Orfeo is booming through the house. I'm struggling to do a single pull-up before work. My sister calls and says she's not feeling well and then asks if I can drop my niece off at daycare. I slowly catch my breath and tell her I'll be there soon. I put on my red hat, my winter coat with the Polish flag on the back, grab my bicycle, and then pedal toward my sister's apartment on 95th. I pretend I'm a car and ride in the street, much to the annoyance of other vehicles. Someone honks their horn and shouts, "Get out of the way." As I ride, I ignore all the noise, all the distractions, and try to imagine an entirely new, improvised composition.
Excellent, thank you. So I would suggest your characters are often quirky.
Okay.
I think that's a good thing.
Okay, good.
Personally. And I guess I mean quirky, like they're quirky, but it's informed by their lives. So it's not quirkiness for quirkiness' sake,
Right.
is my point. But I was interested with your characters, whether emotions come first or desires come first or something else. Like how do you land on a character? Like this is maybe a very personal story.
Right.
But like in general.
I think it starts, well, it's really interesting. Everything I've ever written, every short story or book, like it's not one character. And that's something that was so important to me when I started writing. And it's something I spent a lot of time talking about with students. Like, you can't make a story off of one character. Like even the most fascinating, like a Commodore from the 17th century on a ship, or like I can't. One character.
He still has a sidekick.
Can't make the story. The story starts when the second character shows up. And for a story to work, there has to be tension. There has to be conflict or disagreement. Even if these people love each other, support each other, there has to be a point disconnection or competing desires. This person wants this person wants that. To make the story go. And the sooner you figure that out, and the sooner you start building off of that, that's when the story starts to really reveal itself. Now, I'm not going to lie, Matthew, like sometimes it takes a while to figure that out. And you're like, oh, I thought this book was about this person and then this other. So like this, started with these two brothers. And I couldn't build a book from just the two brothers because there are points of conflict, but it wasn't like strong enough in terms of the opposition. There's opposition, but they really love each other and support each other. There's not like that push-pull. It's really got to be these like two magnets, and your job is like get these magnets closer and closer until there's that push-pull magnetic field. And when the older sister Isabel showed up, then she was strong enough to push this kid, challenge him, have her own problems. And so I think maybe I come at it not from like knowledge about the character or like what they want. Come at it like, I have this character, to make the story work, I have to get someone else who's interesting, who's gonna challenge them and force them to change. And so it's a lot of just like trial and error, like, oh no, that's not it, this is it, or maybe this person, or like in the version that I read, the first draft, Isabel is, I think, much more, she's more raw. In the early draft, she's really more aggressive, more kind of broken down, less maybe sophisticated. And that made it easy for Alex to kind of just like write her off as like a lost cause. But like, what if she's actually as sophisticated or actually smarter? and like can outthink, or whatever, you know what I mean? And then it's like, okay, that gives me something to work with. So once I have that character and this other character that feels equally strong, that sense of opposition, that push pull, then I start thinking like, what are the scenes? What are the scenes where they connect, as they did when they were kids and developed these crazy games and had the sense of really truly supporting. Like, what are the scenes when they're like totally butting heads? And so, really, I started building off of that. And after I've written a bunch of those scenes, only then can I say, like, oh, this is what Alex really wants. Like, this is what he's really after. This is what Isabel really wants. And now I need to, like, go back and rewrite these scenes so that those wants are kind of clear. But for me, it's got to be those two characters that ultimately draw. Whether it's a short, it could be a 10-page short story, or like a 300.
Get the two characters in the same place as soon as possible.
Yes, and like disagreeing, and that doesn't, like when I say conflict, it doesn't mean like someone's yelling or throwing something or there's like a car chase. Like there's this moment, that follows what I just read, where like he goes over to pick up his niece, and you can just tell something's not right, and she's like laying down, and something's off. And you can just tell, just based on her expression. It's not loud. It's not like they're not pushing at each other, but something's wrong. Like, is she on drugs? Is something else happening? And that's enough, to start building this.
All right, we're gonna finish up with this question.
Great.
One thing I think Book of Extraordinary Tragedies seems to ask is, if I change the way I think or believe, will it be enough? It also seems to answer, and we've talked about this, keep exploring. It's in the exploration that life is worth living.
Right.
And so my question, which we've kind of, volleyballed around for a while now, is why are details often so useful in stories, but sometimes so detrimental in life?
Well, wait, say more about the detail part there.
Well, so, one thing that I think I'm guilty of is worrying too much about little things.
Oh, I got it.
Right, where I'm like, well, if I don't do this and get this done by this time, then I can't do this and I can't enjoy this.
Right,
and so forth. But like in a book or in a scene, you want details, but you can't put too many details in, but there has to be something.
Well, let me see if I can answer the fictional question before the more philosophical one. So, in a short story, you have 10, 15, 20 pages to make the shape of the story happen. You get from a beginning, middle, to an end. And so, the way details work in that form is pretty different, I think, than they do. They're complementary to a novel, but just things have to move quicker. And an image has to do 5 things instead of just one thing. And you're trying to compress things. You're just being, I think, much more decisive because of that compression. In a novel, you just have much more space to explore. You're not running up against the clock. Might be 100, 200, 300 pages. You got room to add some additional details. But I think there's a certain amount that you can ask of your reader, to entertain. Here's this image. And does the image deepen the story? Does it give us something we need to know? Does it add complexity to what's going on? I don't think 3 adjectives is necessarily better than 1 adjective, and I really think one really strong image has more weight than 10 images. It's well, what are the images that you introduce early that you come back to later, that you come back to? Yeah. So as Alex has been struggling with his hearing loss, he's refused to learn sign language. It's really, once he finds out his niece is struggling with hearing loss as well, that he starts watching these videos and trying to learn, and then they start learning together. And so there's this reoccurring image, really, of the two of them practicing sign language that are, throughout the book. And that's a critical image because it shows change. So what I'm really trying to do, and you don't know this when you're writing a chapter, and you don't know this till you finish the book, like got a beginning, middle, and end of the book. What are the images that convey the story, that get to the heart of the book, and help demonstrate change? Because those are the images that probably need to stay, and those are probably the images that need. This is maybe where fiction diverts from like real
Right.
life, where like that's beautiful and important. I think it's really critical to like fixate on like, well, this image something that comes again and again. I need to focus on this and go back and add this. And when I recognize working with this book, thinking about how it connects to my own life, is you don't know. And it's frightening, you know. And I would think as like a 48-year-old person, I would know much more. I have much more certainty at this point in my life that I would be able to identify these patterns, the things that happen as a way to prepare for the things that'll happen in the future. And you know, for the last 2 years of pandemic have taught us anything, you know, it really is this question of like not knowing that makes it so difficult. And so like I can either focus on those details and all the things I don't know, focus on all these things I've lost, you know, like focus on these records I can't hear this anymore. Or I can focus on like, here is this thing that I can't say. Or like, I know I'm hearing things. Like listen, like really stopping and listening. It's different. And I have to like accept that. You know what I mean? And kind of giving over to not know and saying like, there's actually something really beautiful. There is actually something really beautiful in like not knowing exactly what's going to happen. And for me, it takes some of the pressure off. And also, I don't really have a choice. Like I recognize like I can stress out or I can be worried, and it still doesn't change the outcome. You know, and like I don't know how much longer my hearing's gonna last. So I can worry about that, or I can just like maybe 2, 3 times a day, just stop, listen, be like, okay, enjoy that, take it in, and who knows, like we'll see how it goes tomorrow or a week from now.
Well, and that is what we discussed earlier, right? The
Right.
life has revision.
Yes, exactly.
And taking the time to think about things.
Right. You got it.
Well, Joe, thanks so much
Matthew,
for
thanks so
doing
much.
this.
Thank you for your amazing questions. I really, really appreciate it.
All right. Well, check out Joe's new book, Book of Extraordinary Tragedies, out now on Akashic Books. All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew.